The story of the American canister round is not one born in a pristine laboratory or a visionary general's mind. It was forged in the mud, the blood, and the sheer desperate necessity of close-quarter combat. To understand its brilliance, one must first erase the image of modern surgical warfare. The battlefields of World War II, from the dense hedgerows of Normandy to the unforgiving jungles of the Pacific, were often brutally intimate. It was in these nightmarish arenas that the American artilleryman, the king of long-range destruction, found himself terrifyingly vulnerable. The standard artillery piece, a howitzer like the ubiquitous 105mm M2A1, was designed for a specific purpose: to fire a high-explosive shell on a high arcing trajectory over the heads of friendly troops to smash enemy positions, concentrations, and supply lines miles behind the front. It was a weapon of indirect fire, of coordinates and mathematics. But what happened when the enemy refused to play by those rules? What happened when they emerged from the fog, or the jungle canopy, or a trench line only a few hundred yards away, swarming towards the gun emplacement in a human wave? The high-explosive shell was nearly useless at point-blank range. Its fuse needed time to arm, and its fragmentation pattern was wildly unpredictable and dangerous to the gunners themselves. Firing a shell over a mile only to have it land a few hundred feet away was a logistical and tactical impossibility. The artillery crew, armed often with only their personal rifles and a few machine guns, was suddenly transformed from a long-range hammer into a fragile, exposed target. This tactical nightmare demanded a solution that was as simple as it was savage. The answer did not require new technology, but a radical reimagining of existing tools. The concept of canister shot was centuries old, dating back to the age of naval warfare and muzzle-loading cannons. It was the principle of the shotgun, scaled up to a monumental degree. American ordnance engineers, driven by this pressing need, looked at this ancient idea and refined it for industrial-age warfare. The result was the M1 canister round for the 105mm howitzer. Its design was a masterpiece of pragmatic brutality. On the outside, it resembled a standard artillery shell, but with critical differences, as the casing was thin-walled, designed not to contain a high-explosive blast, but to safely hold its deadly payload and then disintegrate predictably upon firing. Inside was not a complex fuse and pounds of TNT, but a tightly packed matrix of 1,275 hardened steel balls, each roughly the size of a large marble. These balls were embedded in a resin and sulfur mixture which held them in place during the violent acceleration of firing, but offered no resistance once the round left the barrel. The effect was both simple and horrifyingly effective. When the artillery crew, facing an imminent infantry assault, loaded the M1 canister and fired at point-blank range, often with the barrel near level, a transformation occurred. The moment the shell exited the muzzle, the thin metal casing would peel away like a banana skin. The propellant's force then launched the entire contents, those 1,275 steel balls, forward in a rapidly expanding conical pattern. It was, for all intents and purposes, the discharge of the largest and most powerful shotgun ever fielded. A single round, fired down a valley, a tree line, or across an open field, would saturate an area the size of a football field with a storm of supersonic metal. It could dismantle an entire enemy platoon in the blink of an eye, turning a coordinated charge into a scene of utter carnage. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For the enemy soldier, an artillery barrage was a terrifying ordeal, but it was often impersonal and distant. A canister round was direct, immediate, and visceral. It was a wall of lead and steel delivered with the finality of an executioner's blow. For the American gun crews, it was the ultimate equalizer. It gave them a defense against an overwhelming close-range threat, a weapon that leveraged the immense power of their artillery piece in a way that was perfectly suited for their own survival. It was not a weapon of finesse or strategy. It was a weapon of last resort, of pure, unadulterated defense. This was American military ingenuity at its finest. It was not about creating the most technologically advanced or complex weapons system. It was about identifying a critical problem and solving it with the most direct, efficient, and devastating means possible. The M1 canister was a tool born from the urgent demands of the battlefield, a testament to the idea that the most brilliant solutions are often the simplest ones, repurposed for a new kind of hell. It was, in the most literal sense, the democratization of the artillery's power, delivering its force not in a single localized explosion, but in a widespread democratic distribution of death at close range. This pragmatic, life-saving brutality was the soul of the design, a soul that would be completely missed by its most diligent imitators. The journey of the German copy of the American canister round is a fascinating case study in the perils of imitation, where meticulous engineering can blind its practitioners to the underlying philosophy of a design. It is a story that begins not on the drawing boards of Berlin, but in the foxholes and shattered landscapes where the weapons of the Allies were turning the tide of the war. By 1944, the German Wehrmacht was a force increasingly on the defensive, fighting a brutal war on two fronts against enemies with seemingly bottomless industrial capacity and a knack for practical innovation. In this cauldron of necessity, the capture and analysis of enemy equipment became not just a matter of intelligence, but a potential lifeline. It was in this context that examples of the American M1 canister round for the 105 mm howitzer fell into German hands. The circumstances of their acquisition are lost to history, perhaps a dud round recovered after a failed assault on an American artillery position in the Hürtgen forest, or a fragmentary specimen gathered from the aftermath of a battle in the Italian campaign. Wherever it was found, the object would have been transported back to a German ordnance testing facility, a place where the finest minds of the Reich's Weapons Development Corps meticulously dissected the tools of their enemies. To these German engineers and artillery specialists, the M1 canister round would have presented a puzzle. It was, by their standards of weapon design, almost primitive. It lacked the complex fusing mechanisms of a high-explosive shell, the sophisticated ballistics of an armor-piercing round, or the multifunctional capability of their own emerging shaped charge munitions. It was, in essence, a metal can filled with scrap, yet its effectiveness was undeniable. Reports from the front lines, particularly from the close-quarters hell of the hedgerows in Normandy and the brutal urban combat in towns along the Siegfried Line, spoke of a terrifying American capability. German infantry assaults were being wiped out not by pre-planned barrages, but by a single devastating shot from artillery pieces at point-blank range. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical one. The threat of this artillery shotgun forced a change in German infantry tactics, making them wary of massed assaults against positions known to harbor American 105 mm howitzers. For the German High Command, this was a problem that demanded a solution, and the simplest solution often seemed to be, what the enemy can do, we can do better. Thus began the process of replication. The German institution of weapons development was renowned for its precision, its methodological rigor, and its deep-seated belief in technical superiority. This was the culture that produced the Tiger tank, the V-2 rocket, and the first operational jet fighter. When tasked with creating their own version of the canister round, their approach was characteristically thorough. They were not simply going to copy the American round. They were going to perfect it. The result was the Spring Granate Patron 42, explosive grenade cartridge 42, for the standard German 10.5 mm LEFH-18 field howitzer. On a technical and aesthetic level, the German copy was in many ways a masterpiece of manufacturing. Where the American M1 was a product of utilitarian necessity, designed for mass production and simple function, the Spring Granate Patron 42 bore the hallmarks of German engineering precision. The metallurgy of its casing was likely more consistent. The assembly process would have been subject to rigorous quality control. The payload itself was a matrix of 1,200 hardened steel pellets, a number comparable to its American counterpart, packed with the same kind of resinous binding agent. Externally, it was a near-perfect facsimile, engineered to interface flawlessly with the breech and rifling of the German howitzer. It looked the part, it fit the part. By all accounts, when fired at a test range against a target representing massed infantry, it performed its primary function spectacularly, producing a wide, lethal cone of shrapnel that could eviscerate any formation in its path. This is where the German engineers stopped. They had successfully reverse-engineered the physical object. They had understood its mechanics and replicated its terminal effect. But in their intense focus on the form of the weapon, they completely failed to grasp its function within a broader tactical and procedural context. The German military, for all its operational brilliance at the strategic level, was often rigid and doctrinaire at the tactical level. Procedures were codified, and deviations were discouraged. The concept of a last-ditch weapon that existed outside of standard firing protocols was somewhat alien to their system. Consequently, the Spring Granate Patron 42 was issued to artillery units as just another type of ammunition. It was slotted into the standard logistics chain and, most critically, it was governed by the standard safety and loading procedures for the LEFH-18 howitzer. These procedures, born from decades of experience with conventional high-explosive shells, were designed for sustained, indirect fire missions. In such a context, speed of firing was paramount. A standard practice, therefore, was to have the next round ready to be loaded immediately after the previous one was fired. This meant that a second shell was often held by the loader, his hand on the breech block, ready to be rammed home the instant the gun recoiled and was relayed. The entire rhythm of the gun crew was built around this continuous cycle of fire. The American M1 canister, by its very nature as an emergency defensive round, broke this cycle. Its use was a singular catastrophic event for the attacker, after which the immediate threat was presumed neutralized. It was a fire and reset weapon. The German copy, however, was treated as part of the continuous fire cycle. This doctrinal blindness created a fatal oversight. The German engineers, in their quest to replicate the object, never thought to issue a new, critical procedural directive. When firing the Spring Granate Patron 42, the breech must be clear, and no subsequent round can be in the immediate process of loading. They had copied the weapon, but they had failed to copy the wisdom that governed its use. They had mastered the form, but missed the function, a mistake that would have catastrophic consequences for their own gun crews. The fundamental and ultimately fatal distinction between the American M1 canister and its German counterpart, the Sprenggranatpatrone 42, was not a matter of metallurgy, ballistics, or payload. It was a distinction of soul. The American round was the physical embodiment of a specific, desperate tactical scenario, a solution to a single, terrifying problem. The German round was merely a new piece of ammunition slotted into an existing, rigid doctrinal framework that was utterly ill-suited to its unique characteristics. The missing detail was not a physical component one could hold in one's hand. It was a line of text in a manual, a shouted order from a sergeant, a fundamental shift in crew drill that the German system, in its hubris and rigidity, failed to perceive or implement. This was the devil in the doctrine, and its price would be paid not in failed missions, but in the obliteration of the very weapons and men it was meant to save. To fully grasp the nature of this catastrophic oversight, one must first understand the environment for which the American round was conceived and the explicit, non-negotiable procedures that governed its use. For an American artillery crew of the 105 mm howitzer, the M1 canister was not considered ammunition in the conventional sense. It was not part of a fire mission called in by a forward observer. It was not stacked alongside high-explosive HE and smoke shells for a scheduled barrage. It was a specialized tool for close-quarters combat, treated with the same urgency and singularity as a soldier's last grenade. Its storage was often separate. A few rounds kept in a readily accessible locker near the gun shield, or even placed on the ground beside the trails, reserved for the moment the perimeter was breached and the enemy was sighted advancing directly on the gun position. The training for its use was starkly simple and relentlessly drilled. When the order, canister, was given, everything else stopped. The ongoing fire mission was abandoned. The crew's focus shifted from indirect support to direct point-blank self-defense. The loading and firing sequence was a deliberate break from all standard procedure. The gun would be traversed and depressed manually, its barrel leveled like a giant rifle to aim directly at the threat. The loader would clear the breach completely. No other round could be in the process of being loaded. He would then ram the M1 canister home. The gun would be fired. The effect was, as intended, catastrophic for the attackers. But the sequence did not end there. The most critical unwritten step followed. A pause. In the ringing silence after the thunderous discharge, amidst the carnage it had wrought, the crew would assess the situation. Was the threat neutralized? Was a second round needed? Only after this momentary assessment would the crew either load another canister or, if the threat was destroyed, begin the process of clearing the gun and potentially returning to their indirect fire mission. The entire process was a self-contained defensive event, isolated from the normal rhythm of artillery fire. The German system had no such doctrine. The Sprenggranatpatrone 42 was issued through standard channels and treated as a new type of Sprenggranat and explosive shell. It was catalogued, stored in ammunition crates alongside high-explosive rounds, and drawn for use in the same manner. The highly trained, disciplined crews of the LEFH-18 howitzer were creatures of habit and regulation. Their efficiency was born from a relentless, repetitive drill designed for maximum rate of fire in sustained barrages. This drill was a ballet of coordinated motion. As one round was fired and the gun recoiled, the breech would automatically open, ejecting the hot, spent casing. Simultaneously, the loader standing by, a fresh shell already in his hands, would immediately ram this new round into the smoking breech, the moment the gun returned to battery. The breech block would slam shut, and the gun would be ready to fire again in a matter of seconds. This was the standard practice, the Führung und Gefecht der verbundenen Waffen, command and battle of combined arms, made manifest. It was this very efficiency that became a death sentence. The fatal flaw of the Sprenggranatpatron 42 lay in its internal ballistics, which were identical to the American round. Upon firing, the thin-walled casing of the canister round would disintegrate as it traveled down the barrel, releasing its payload of steel balls. However, this process was not perfectly clean. It created an immense and unpredictable back pressure of superheated gases and potentially fragments of the sabot or casing itself, jetting back through the bore and into the breech. This phenomenon was inconsequential when the breech was empty and being cleared. But when a German crew followed their standard drill, the loader would have already been in the process of ramming the next round, almost invariably a standard high-explosive shell, into the breech behind the just-fired canister. The result was a perfect storm for a catastrophic explosion. The violent backblast from the disintegrating canister round would strike the exposed nose of the high-explosive shell that was being loaded. The sensitive impact fuse of that HE shell, designed to detonate upon hitting a much softer target, would be instantly initiated. Alternatively, the sheer thermal shock and pressure could cause the HE shell's filler, such as TNT or amatol, to sympathetically detonate. The explosion would not be a contained event downrange. It would be an uncontained detonation inside the breech of the gun. The force of the blast would utterly destroy the howitzer, shattering its barrel and tearing apart its carriage. The crew, clustered around the weapon in the act of serving it, would be killed instantly, victims of their own discipline and the doctrinal blindness of their superiors. There were no second chances with this failure. A misfire with a conventional shell could be dealt with. A barrel obstruction could sometimes be cleared, but a breech explosion was almost always fatal to the gun and its crew. The reports from the front would have been fragmented and confused, a gun battery here or there simply vanishing from the roster after reporting contact with enemy infantry. The official cause might be listed as direct enemy action or gun destroyed, the true mechanism lost in the fog of war. The surviving German artillerymen would have developed a superstitious dread for the Sprenggranatpatron 42, a weapon that seemed to turn on its masters. They could not have known that the flaw was not in the weapon's construction, but in the manual that dictated its use. The American brilliance was not in the canister itself, but in the understanding that some tools require their own unique rules. The Germans, in their pursuit of technical perfection, copied the tool but ignored the instructions, and in doing so, they transformed a life-saving instrument into a suicide device.